What if I told you there's a place where the laws of physics don't apply? Where bullets bounce off flesh like pebbles off steel, where portals to other dimensions tear open in the night sky, and where invisible predators stalk the land with an intelligence that defies explanation. This isn't the plot of a science fiction movie. This is Skinwalker Ranch, a 480-acre property in northern Utah that has been called the most scientifically documented paranormal hotspot on Earth. And what happened to one family who dared to call this cursed land home is so disturbing, so inexplicable, that it challenges everything we think we know about reality itself. Northern Utah's Uintah Basin has always been different. The native tribes knew it. The early settlers whispered about it. Even today, 3 out of every 4 people living in this desolate stretch of high desert country will tell you they've seen something they can't explain. Unidentified lights dancing across the horizon, massive humanoid figures stalking through the sagebrush, cattle found dead with injuries that defy natural explanation. The Ute people, who have called this region home for centuries, speak of it in hushed, fearful tones. They warn outsiders to stay away from certain places, particularly one sprawling ranch nestled in a valley about 100 miles east of Salt Lake City. The Utes believe this land sits directly in the path of the Skinwalker, a malevolent shape-shifting entity from Navajo legend that can transform into any animal it chooses. According to tribal history, the Navajo placed a curse on this specific location generations ago, and that curse has never been lifted. Tribal members are strictly forbidden from setting foot on the property. They call it Skinwalker Ranch, and they consider it one of the most dangerous places in North America. For decades, this warning went largely unheeded by outsiders. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, the ranch was owned by a family whose identity has been carefully protected, hidden behind layers of anonymity that persist to this day. We know almost nothing about them except for one crucial detail. In 1987, after years of living on the property, they suddenly abandoned it. No explanation was given. No forwarding address was left. They simply packed up and disappeared, leaving their home to sit empty and deteriorating for more than 7 years. The ranch became a local curiosity, a forgotten piece of prime real estate that nobody seemed to want despite its obvious value. Real estate agents struggled to explain why such a beautiful property remained unsold for so long. Then in 1994, a family finally took a chance on the mysterious abandoned ranch. Their names were Terry and Gwen Sherman, and they had 2 teenage children. Terry was a successful high-end cattle breeder with an excellent reputation in the industry. He raised premium Simmental and Angus breeding stock, the kind of animals that could sell for tens of thousands of dollars each. The ranch seemed like the perfect opportunity to expand his operation. The property had everything he needed: expansive pastures for grazing, natural water sources, tree cover for shade, and most importantly, complete isolation from neighbors who might complain about the smell or noise of a working cattle ranch. When the real estate agent quoted him the asking price, Terry couldn't believe his luck. The property was being sold for a fraction of its actual value, far below what comparable ranches in the area were going for. He didn't ask too many questions. He didn't want to give the sellers a chance to reconsider. He simply signed the paperwork, shook hands, and accepted the deed to his new property with a sense of overwhelming excitement. This was his dream come true, the culmination of years of hard work and careful planning. He had no way of knowing that he had just purchased a ticket to a living nightmare that would push him to the brink of financial ruin and psychological collapse. The first signs that something was wrong appeared during their initial walkthrough of the main homestead. The house itself was in rough shape, which was expected given that it had been vacant for 7 years. Weather damage, peeling paint, overgrown vegetation, none of that concerned Terry and Gwen. They were prepared for extensive renovations. What did concern them were the security measures. Every single door in the house, including interior doors between rooms, had heavy-duty deadbolts installed. The windows were similarly secured, with locks that seemed absurdly robust for a remote ranch in the middle of nowhere. At the front and back entrances, they discovered something even more unusual: thick chains bolted into the walls with industrial-strength metal rungs. These weren't decorative. They were clearly designed to secure large, powerful guard dogs in position, preventing them from leaving their posts no matter what threatened the home. Terry ran his fingers over one of the chains, noting how worn it was, how often it must have been used. Who were the previous owners afraid of? Why did they feel the need to turn their home into a fortress? When Terry and Gwen met with the previous owners to finalize the sale, they got their first real indication that this property had a dark history. The elderly couple who had lived there were strange, to put it mildly. They spoke in vague terms about the ranch, avoiding direct answers to simple questions. Their hands trembled slightly when signing the final documents. Most disturbing of all were the unusual clauses they had inserted into the real estate contract. The new owners were prohibited from digging anywhere on the property without explicit written permission from the previous owners. Any excavation, even for routine maintenance or fence posts, required advance notice and approval. Terry found this bizarre, but he was so eager to close the deal that he didn't push back. He simply agreed to the terms, assuming the old couple was paranoid or eccentric. Gwen was less certain. Something about the way the woman had looked at her during the signing, a mixture of pity and relief, stuck with her for days afterward. It was as if the woman was grateful to be escaping something, and sorry that someone else would now have to face it. The weirdness began on day one. Not day two, not week one, but literally on the first day they arrived to move in. Terry, Gwen, their two children, and Terry's father were unloading boxes from a truck parked in front of the main house. It was a beautiful afternoon, warm and clear, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sagebrush across the pastures. Terry was feeling optimistic, energized, ready to begin this new chapter of his life. Then Gwen pointed toward the southern pasture and said something that made everyone stop what they were doing. "What is that?" She wasn't panicking, just curious, pointing at something moving toward them across the open land. At first, it looked like a large dog, but as it got closer, Terry realized this was no ordinary animal. It was a wolf, and it was massive. He had seen wolves before in zoos and wildlife documentaries, but this creature was at least 3 times the size of a normal wolf. Its shoulder height would have easily reached the chest of an average man. As it approached, Terry instinctively moved toward the truck, mentally cataloging where he had stored his firearms. But the wolf's behavior was completely non-threatening. It wasn't stalking or hunting. It was simply walking toward them with a casual, almost friendly demeanor. Its tail wagging slightly, Terry's father, a fearless man who had spent his entire life working with animals, was the first to approach it. He extended his hand slowly, and the massive wolf allowed itself to be petted. Its fur was thick and surprisingly soft. Its eyes were a striking, intelligent blue that seemed almost human in their expressiveness. The family gathered around cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence, as the wolf continued to display nothing but gentle curiosity. Terry's son scratched behind its ears. Gwen ran her hand along its back, marveling at its size. For a few minutes they all relaxed, laughing at the absurdity of the situation. What were the odds that a tame wolf, clearly someone's pet that had gotten loose, would wander onto their property on their very first day? Then Terry glanced to his left and felt his blood turn to ice. About 70 feet away was a corral where he had placed 4 of his breeding cows and several calves earlier that morning. The adult cows were pressing themselves against the far side of the pen, clearly terrified of the wolf's presence. But one calf, too young and curious to understand the danger, had stuck its head between the metal bars of the fence, watching the scene with wide, innocent eyes. The wolf's entire demeanor changed in an instant. One moment it was the picture of domesticated gentleness. Next it was a predator moving with terrifying speed and purpose. Before anyone could react, the wolf had crossed the distance to the corral and clamped its enormous jaws around the calf's head. The young cow let out a high-pitched bleat of terror and pain, thrashing violently as the wolf began trying to drag it through the narrow opening between the fence bars. Terry didn't hesitate. He grabbed an axe handle from the bed of his truck and ran toward the corral, bringing the wooden handle down hard on the wolf's back and sides. He kicked at its legs, shouted at it, hit it again and again with all his strength. The wolf didn't react. It didn't yelp or flinch or even acknowledge that it was being struck. It simply continued pulling at the calf with mechanical determination, as if Terry didn't exist. "Get my magnum!" Terry shouted to his son, not taking his eyes off the wolf. His son sprinted to the truck, retrieved a .357 Magnum revolver from the glove compartment, and handed it to his father. Terry pressed the barrel against the wolf's abdomen, so close he could feel the heat of its body, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed across the empty pasture like a crack of thunder. At this range, the bullet should have torn completely through the animal, creating a devastating wound that would have dropped it instantly. Instead, nothing happened. The wolf didn't react. It didn't stumble or release its grip. It simply continued mauling the calf as if the gun had never been fired. Terry's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. He checked the revolver, confirming it was loaded with live rounds, then fired again. Same result. No reaction, no blood, no effect whatsoever. Growing desperate, he fired a third shot directly at the wolf's center mass. This time, the creature slowly released the calf and backed away about 10 feet. But there was still no blood, no visible injury, nothing to indicate it had just been shot 3 times at point-blank range with a weapon powerful enough to take down a bear. The wolf stood there, calmly staring at Terry with those unsettling blue eyes, as if considering whether to attack again. Terry's hands were shaking now, not from fear exactly, but from the profound wrongness of what he was witnessing. This was impossible. Nothing could survive 3 shots from a .357 Magnum, especially not at this range. He aimed carefully at where he knew the wolf's heart would be and fired a 4th shot. The wolf retreated another 30 feet but remained standing, watching the family with an expression that Terry would later describe as almost intelligent, as if it was evaluating them, deciding whether they were worth the trouble. "Get the .30-06, Terry said quietly to his son, his voice surprisingly steady, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. His son ran into the house and returned moments later with a hunting rifle, a much more powerful weapon than the handgun. Terry took aim with the rifle, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. At this point, he almost felt sorry for the animal. Whatever was wrong with it, whatever made it immune to handgun rounds, surely couldn't protect it from a high-powered rifle. He squeezed the trigger, and the rifle kicked hard against his shoulder. He saw the bullet impact, saw the wolf stagger slightly from the force, but still it didn't go down. He fired again, and this time he clearly saw a chunk of flesh tear away from the wolf's flank and hit the ground. Finally, visible damage, but incredibly, impossibly, the wolf still didn't collapse. Instead, it gave the calf one last lingering look, then turned and trotted away to the south, moving with the same casual, unhurried gait it had displayed when it first approached. Terry stood there, gun in hand, watching it disappear into the distance. His father came up beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder, but neither man spoke. What was there to say? Terry knew he couldn't allow a large predator to remain on his property, especially one that had already attacked his livestock. He called to his son, and the two of them set off after the wolf, following its tracks across the southern pasture. The trail was easy to follow at first, clear paw prints in the soft earth leading through patches of cottonwood and Russian olive trees. They tracked it for about half an hour, moving through increasingly dense vegetation, always keeping the tracks in sight. Eventually they emerged from a thicket of Russian olives and found themselves standing on a wide, muddy bank beside the creek that ran through the southern portion of the property. The wolf's tracks were clearly visible in the soft mud, deep impressions showing where its enormous paws had sunk into the earth. Terry and his son followed the prints across the open expanse, eyes locked on the trail ahead. Then, about 40 yards from the water's edge, the tracks simply stopped. Not at the creek, not at a patch of hard ground or rocks that might have concealed further prints. They just ended, right in the middle of a wide-open stretch of wet, muddy bank, where any movement in any direction would have left obvious marks. Terry knelt down and examined the final print carefully, running his fingers along the impression. The depth and clarity indicated the wolf had been moving at a normal walking pace, not running or jumping. There was no way it could have leaped 40 yards in any direction to reach solid ground. It was as if the creature had simply vanished into thin air or been plucked up by something above. Terry stood slowly, his eyes scanning the surrounding area, looking for any explanation that made sense. There was none. He and his son walked in expanding circles around the final print, searching for any continuation of the trail, but they found nothing. Eventually, in silence, they made their way back to the homestead. As they walked, Terry bent down and picked up the chunk of flesh that had torn away from the wolf when he'd shot it with the rifle. He examined it closely and felt a fresh wave of unease wash over him. The flesh looked wrong. It wasn't as fresh and bloody as it should have been. Instead, it looked old, almost rotten. with a grey-green tinge and an unmistakable smell of decay. It was as if the wolf had been dead for days, yet he had just watched it walk away. He dropped the piece of rotten meat and wiped his hand on his jeans, trying to shake off the growing sense that something was very, very wrong with this place. That was day one. Just the first day. Over the following weeks, life at the ranch settled into an uneasy rhythm. The wolf incident became a strange story they told themselves, something they couldn't explain, but tried to file away and forget. Terry was busy transporting more of his valuable breeding stock onto the property, getting fences repaired, and making the homestead livable. Gwen focused on unpacking and organizing the house, trying to make it feel like a home rather than the abandoned shell they had purchased. But small disturbing things kept happening, mostly to Gwen. At first, she didn't tell anyone because she genuinely thought she was losing her mind. She would come home from grocery shopping in town, unpack all the food and put it away in the cabinets and refrigerator. Then she would leave the kitchen to use the bathroom or check on something elsewhere in the house. When she returned, sometimes just minutes later, all the groceries would be back in their bags on the counter, exactly as they had been when she first brought them inside. The first time it happened, she stood staring at the bags in complete confusion, trying to remember if she had actually unpacked them or just thought about doing it. The second time it happened, she knew she wasn't misremembering. Someone or something was repacking her groceries. Other incidents followed. She would go to take her morning shower, carefully locking the bathroom door behind her. She would place her towel and hairbrush on the counter beside the sink, right where she could easily reach them. After her shower, she would step out of the tub to find them missing. Not fallen on the floor, not moved to a different spot in the bathroom, but completely gone. Hours later, she would discover them in random locations throughout the house, places she definitely hadn't left them. Once she found her hairbrush on top of the refrigerator. Another time, her towel was folded neatly on their bed upstairs. She began to dread showering because she never knew if her things would be there when she finished. The incidents made her feel violated, watched, as if invisible eyes were following her every movement, waiting for opportunities to mess with her. She started questioning her own memory, wondering if the stress of the move was affecting her mentally. It wasn't until Terry had his own experience that she realized she wasn't going crazy. One evening, Terry came into the house visibly frustrated, asking everyone if they had taken his post digger. This was a heavy piece of equipment used for digging fence post holes, weighing over 70 pounds and standing about 6 feet tall. He had been using it to repair a section of damaged fence in the eastern pasture. He'd set it down for just a moment to adjust a post, and when he turned back, it was gone. He'd searched the immediate area thoroughly, but it had simply vanished. Gwen explained that she and the children had been inside all afternoon and evening, nowhere near that part of the ranch. They all went out with flashlights to search, combing through the area where Terry had been working, but found nothing. The post digger had disappeared as completely as if it had never existed. 3 weeks later, Terry was riding through a distant section of the property when he happened to glance up into a large cottonwood tree. There, wedged firmly in the branches about 70 feet off the ground, was his post digger. There was no conceivable explanation for how it got there. The tool was far too heavy for one person to carry up a tree, and there were no ladders or climbing equipment on the property. Even if someone had gone to enormous effort to place it there as a prank, why would they? And how did they do it without Terry seeing or hearing anything? By this point, the Sherman family was beginning to accept that their beautiful ranch came with unexplainable phenomena. They tried to rationalize it, tried to find logical explanations, but the incidents kept piling up in ways that defied conventional understanding. Then the lights started appearing. The first time Terry saw them, it was about a week before they rediscovered the post digger. A nephew was visiting from out of state, and Terry decided to give the boy a tour of the ranch. His son also came along, and by the time they were heading back toward the homestead, the sun had fully set and darkness had fallen across the landscape. A few hundred yards ahead of them, Terry noticed what appeared to be vehicle headlights moving slowly along a distant fence line, well within the boundaries of his property. He had seen similar lights on a previous occasion and had assumed someone had taken a wrong turn off the main road to the east, gotten lost, and was trying to find their way back. But now, seeing them again in almost the same location, he began to suspect someone was using his land for hunting without permission. This was illegal and potentially dangerous. especially with his valuable cattle grazing in the area. He decided to confront whoever it was and started walking briskly in the direction of the lights. As he picked up his pace, the lights began moving away from him. He walked faster, now at a jog, and the boys jogged alongside him. What struck him as strange was the complete absence of engine noise. They were close enough that they should have been able to hear a vehicle, but there was only silence. They closed to within about 100 yards, near enough that Terry was preparing to shout out to whoever was driving, when the lights suddenly lifted off the ground. They rose smoothly and silently into the air, floating up and over a line of distant trees before disappearing completely. Terry and the boys stood frozen, staring at the empty sky. His nephew was the first to speak, his voice shaky with excitement and fear. "Uncle Terry, what was that?" Terry didn't have an answer. He didn't know what to tell the boy, because he had no idea what they had just witnessed. Some kind of aircraft, a drone? Neither explanation made sense given the size and behavior of the lights. They returned to the house in silence, each of them processing what they had seen in their own way. As autumn progressed and Terry continued moving more of his prize-winning cattle onto the ranch, the light phenomena became increasingly frequent. They appeared almost nightly now, sometimes distant and sometimes disturbingly close, and as the lights increased, so did the disappearances. Terry's first major loss came on a bitterly cold night during the first major snowstorm of winter. One of his most valuable Angus cows had gone missing, and he'd been searching for her for almost an entire day. He had covered virtually the entire ranch, except for a dense section of woodland in the southwest corner, which he was now approaching on horseback. As he neared the tree line, he was relieved to see hoofprints in the deep snow, confirming that his cow had headed in this direction. He followed the tracks carefully, noting that the spacing between prints indicated she had been running at full speed when she entered the woods. This was unusual behavior for a cow, especially in the middle of a snowstorm. Cattle typically sought shelter during bad weather, not running blindly into unfamiliar territory. Something had spooked her badly. The tracks led him 20 yards into the trees and then out into a wide clearing. Terry followed them to the center of the open space, then reined in his horse and sat staring in disbelief at the ground. The tracks simply ended. The cow's prints were clearly visible in the undisturbed snow, a straight line leading to this exact spot, and then nothing. No tracks leading away in any direction, no signs of a struggle, no blood or disturbed snow indicating something had dragged her off. She had simply ceased to exist in this spot. Terry thought immediately of the wolf, how its tracks had ended in the same impossible way on that muddy creek bank. A cold dread settled over him that had nothing to do with the winter storm. He searched the surrounding area for over an hour, but found no trace of his missing cow. She was simply gone. Over the course of that winter, 4 more of his prized cattle would disappear in similar fashion, always leaving tracks that led to a specific point and then stopped, as if the animals had been plucked out of existence by an invisible hand. Terry became obsessed with protecting his remaining herd. He began spending entire nights outdoors, moving silently through the darkness with weapons and night vision equipment, determined to catch whoever or whatever was stealing his cattle. He would hide in tree lines, crouch behind equipment and creep through the shadows like a ghost, trying to get the element of surprise. But something always seemed to know he was there. The lights would move away if he approached them. Strange sounds that seemed to be coming from one location would suddenly emanate from somewhere else entirely, as if leading him on a wild goose chase. He never managed to get close enough to see anything clearly. It was as if an intelligent force was toying with him, staying just beyond his reach, mocking his efforts to protect his property. Then one freezing night in the early hours before dawn, something finally let him get close. Terry was making his way back toward the homestead after yet another fruitless patrol, when movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. He turned his head slowly and felt his breath catch in his throat. About 100 yards to his left, silhouetted against the pale white snow, was a black object hovering about 20 feet off the ground. He immediately dropped into a crouch and watched the object carefully. It was moving slowly across his land, and as it turned slightly, he could make out its shape more clearly. It looked like a smaller, more compact version of the F-117 Nighthawk stealth aircraft, all sharp angles and flat surfaces, but somehow different. What made it truly bizarre was the complete absence of sound. The F-117 was notoriously loud, its engines producing a distinctive roar that could be heard from miles away. This craft, whatever it was utterly silent. It defied every principle of aviation he understood. Colored lights on its underside swept across the snow in methodical patterns, as if searching for something. Terry barely dared to breathe as he watched it maneuver across the landscape. He observed it for about 15 minutes, mentally recording every detail he could, in case he ever got the chance to report this to someone who might believe him. The craft moved west, then turned and headed back east, its lights continuing their search pattern. Terry had been sitting motionless for so long that his muscles were beginning to cramp. Without thinking, he stretched slightly, and his joints cracked with small popping sounds. In the deathly silence of the winter night, the sound seemed impossibly loud, though in reality it was so quiet it wouldn't have been audible beyond 6 feet. But the craft reacted immediately. The lights went out. Complete darkness. Then the object stopped moving and slowly rotated in Terry's direction. He felt a primal terror flood through him as the craft seemed to stare at him across the distance. He was completely exposed, sitting in an open field with nowhere to hide. For several agonizing seconds, the craft remained motionless, pointed directly at him. Terry's heart hammered in his chest so hard he thought it might burst. He didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the craft slowly rotated away and silently floated off toward the north until it disappeared from view. Terry sat in the snow for another 20 minutes, making absolutely certain it was gone before he finally stood on shaking legs and made his way back to the house. He didn't tell Gwen about the encounter. He wasn't sure how to put it into words that wouldn't make him sound insane. As winter gave way to spring and the snow melted away, the cattle that had disappeared began reappearing. But they weren't alive. Some were found dead with no visible cause of death, their bodies intact but lifeless, as if they had simply been switched off. Others were discovered in states of horrific mutilation. These were the cases that disturbed Terry most deeply. Large sections of flesh and hide were carved away with precision that suggested surgical instruments rather than animal predators. The edges of the wounds were perfectly smooth, almost cauterized, with no tearing or ragged tissue. What made it even more inexplicable was the complete absence of blood. Even when massive amounts of tissue had been removed, there was never any blood on the ground around the carcass, no blood soaking into the animal's remaining hide. It was as if the blood had been completely drained or removed before the cutting began. Terry had worked with cattle his entire life and had seen his share of predator kills from mountain lions, bears, and coyotes. Those kills were messy, violent, and unmistakable. This was something else entirely, something that spoke of intelligence and purpose rather than natural predation. The financial and emotional toll on the Sherman family was becoming unbearable. Every lost animal represented thousands of dollars in breeding stock value, not to mention the years of careful genetic selection and animal husbandry that went into producing each one. More than the money, though, was the psychological weight of the constant phenomena. By 1995, the activity had escalated to levels that seemed almost designed to drive them away. The lights appeared almost nightly. Poltergeist activity in the homestead intensified. Objects didn't just move or disappear anymore. They seemed to actively mock the family. Tools would vanish and reappear in impossible locations. Locked doors would be found standing wide open. Strange sounds echoed through the house at all hours, sometimes resembling machinery running beneath their feet, as if there was an entire facility hidden underground. Neighbors began reporting their own experiences, hearing disembodied voices speaking in unknown languages that seemed to come from the sky itself. One morning, Terry walked outside to discover 3 perfectly circular holes dug into his land, each about 5 feet in diameter and 6 feet deep. They looked as if they had been cut with massive cookie cutters. What disturbed him most was that there were no piles of displaced earth anywhere nearby. Hundreds of pounds of soil had been silently removed from his property during the night, and there was no trace of where it had gone. The creatures became more frequent and more varied as the months passed. Terry and his family witnessed things that seemed to come from nightmare or folklore. Massive bipedal figures resembling the legendary Bigfoot were seen walking across distant pastures, their stride covering ground at an impossible rate. Strange canine creatures with features resembling both dogs and hyenas prowled the perimeter of the property, occasionally attacking livestock with vicious efficiency. These animals had oversized claws that left distinctive marks on their victims, deep parallel gouges that looked more like they had been made by a bear than any canine. There was also something invisible that moved through the property on a regular basis. They never saw the entity itself, only the effects of its presence. Cattle would suddenly part down the middle, as if something large was walking through the herd. Water in the irrigation canal would splash and displace, as if invisible feet were stomping through it. On one particularly unnerving occasion, Terry watched fresh snow receive a line of impressions, deep footprints appearing one after another in a steady walking pattern. But there was nothing visible creating them. Another creature that appeared periodically seemed to be using some form of camouflage technology. The best way Terry could describe it was like the alien entity from the movie Predator, a barely visible distortion in the air that moved with purpose and intelligence. He saw it 3 times, always at dusk, always moving near the tree lines. It resembled a large humanoid figure, but the light bent around it in a way that made it nearly transparent. The only reason he could see it at all was because of the way it disrupted the background, creating a shimmer effect like heat waves rising off hot pavement. Each time he tried to approach it or get a better look, it would simply fade into complete invisibility and disappear. The phenomena that Terry feared most, though, were the orbs. These appeared less frequently than the lights or creatures, but when they did show up, they were impossible to ignore. Most were about the size of tennis balls, glowing with an intense blood-red color. They would zip in and out of trees, hover over the pastures, and sometimes chase or harass the cattle. The animals clearly perceived the orbs as threats and would panic when they appeared. But the red orbs, unsettling as they were, paled in comparison to the blue ones. The blue orbs were larger, roughly the size of basketballs, and they possessed a quality that Terry could only describe as malevolent. When one appeared near you, you felt it before you saw it. An overwhelming sense of dread and anxiety would wash over you, a primal fear response that seemed completely disproportionate to what you were actually seeing. It was as if the orbs generated some kind of signal or vibration that directly triggered the fear centers of the human brain. Terry and Gwen came to call them the Blue Meanies, and they feared these orbs more than anything else on the ranch, more than the disappearing wolf, more than the silent craft, more than any of the creatures they had encountered. There was something deeply wrong about the blue orbs, something that suggested genuine malevolence rather than mere strangeness. One spring evening, Terry was sitting on his porch as the sun set, a habit he had developed as a way to monitor the phenomena that plagued his property. He was cleaning one of his rifles, trying to find some normalcy in the routine maintenance of his equipment. Movement at the tree line caught his eye, and he looked up to see an ominous blue glow emerging from the woods about 50 yards from the house. His 3 best hunting dogs were lying on the porch beside him, and the moment they spotted the blue orb, they went into full alert mode. These were experienced hunting dogs, trained and fearless, dogs that had treed mountain lions and cornered wild boar without hesitation. They began growling and barking aggressively at the approaching orb, their hackles raised and their bodies tense with aggression. For once, Terry felt a surge of hope. Whatever psychological effect the blue orbs had on humans, it clearly didn't work on dogs. Without really thinking it through, Terry stood and gave his dogs the command to attack. They launched off the porch like rockets, barking furiously as they chased the blue orb back into the tree line. Terry stood on the porch, straining to see into the darkness between the trees, listening to his dog's aggressive barking grow more distant. He felt a grim satisfaction that finally, something on this cursed ranch was going to face actual consequences. Then suddenly, there were 3 sharp yelps of pain, almost simultaneous, and then absolute silence. The barking stopped. The growling stopped. Everything stopped. Terry called out to his dogs, whistling and shouting their names into the darkness, but there was no response. He waited on the porch for over 2 hours, his rifle in his hands, hoping to hear the familiar sound of his dogs returning. But they never came. He was far too afraid to venture into those woods in the darkness, not after what had happened to his dogs, not knowing what that blue orb was capable of. When dawn finally broke, he and his son armed themselves and went to search the area where he had last heard his dogs. They found the remains about 40 yards into the tree line. 3 piles of what could barely be identified as organic matter, still smoking slightly in the cool morning air. The flesh looked as if it had been subjected to intense heat, almost vaporized. There were no recognizable body parts, no bones, no fur, just these smoldering gelatinous piles that had once been 3 healthy, vibrant hunting dogs. Terry stood looking at the remains of his dogs and felt something break inside him. This was the final straw. This crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Over the past 2 years, he and his family had endured things that would have driven most people away within weeks. They had lost 14 heads of valuable breeding cattle, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. They had watched their savings evaporate as the ranch failed to generate any income. Gwen had lost her job at the bank in town because the stress and sleep deprivation had affected her performance. The children's grades had plummeted because they were too exhausted and traumatized to focus on school. The entire family had taken to sleeping in the same room because none of them felt safe alone at night, not with the shadowy figures that now regularly entered the house, walking through rooms and standing at the ends of beds, watching them with invisible eyes. They had reached the point of complete financial ruin and were teetering on the edge of psychological collapse. And now 3 of their dogs had been vaporized by something that shouldn't even exist. The danger was no longer theoretical or financial. It was immediate and potentially lethal. They couldn't stay here anymore. They had to get out before something happened to one of them, or to the children. Months earlier, in a desperate attempt to get help, or at least document what was happening, Terry had contacted a local newspaper about the phenomena occurring on his ranch. The reporter who had taken his call had been skeptical, but intrigued enough to write a small article. As expected, Terry had been roundly mocked and ridiculed. Neighbors who already thought he was strange now avoided him entirely. People in town whispered that he was crazy, that the isolation had gotten to him, that he was making up stories to excuse his failing business. But the article had been picked up by other publications, spreading beyond the local area. By pure chance, it came to the attention of a man named Robert Bigelow. Bigelow was a billionaire businessman from Las Vegas who had made his fortune in the real estate and hotel industry. But he had another passion that consumed much of his wealth and attention: the investigation of paranormal and anomalous phenomena. He had recently established an organization called the National Institute for Discovery Science, known as NIDS, staffed with scientists, investigators, and researchers whose mission was to study reports of high strangeness with serious academic rigor. When Bigelow read about Skinwalker Ranch, he recognized it immediately as potentially one of the most significant paranormal research opportunities in modern history. He contacted Terry and made him an offer. Bigelow would purchase the ranch outright, paying fair market value, and Terry and his family could walk away free of the nightmare they had been living. For Terry, it was like being thrown a lifeline while drowning. He didn't even try to negotiate a higher price. He just wanted out. The paperwork was finalized quickly, and by July 1996, the Sherman family had packed their belongings and left Skinwalker Ranch forever. They never looked back. They never returned. They simply tried to rebuild their lives and put the trauma behind them. By September of that same year, Bigelow's NIDS team had moved onto the property. They came equipped with millions of dollars worth of scientific equipment, surveillance technology, and personnel trained in everything from physics to psychology. They set up monitoring stations, installed cameras, and prepared to conduct the most comprehensive study of paranormal phenomena ever attempted. They would remain on the ranch for nearly a decade, experiencing their own encounters with the inexplicable, gathering data that would challenge the foundations of conventional science. But that's a story for another time. For now, what matters is that the Sherman family's ordeal had finally ended. The 2 years they had spent on that cursed land had nearly destroyed them in every way possible. Financially, psychologically, emotionally. They had come seeking a dream and had instead found a waking nightmare. They had witnessed things that most people would dismiss as impossible, things that defied the laws of physics and biology and reason. But whatever had been tormenting them for those 2 terrible years was about to face something it had never encountered before: sustained scientific scrutiny. Her team of fearless, well-funded investigators was moving in, armed with technology and determination. The entity or entities that haunted Skinwalker Ranch had spent decades terrorizing anyone who dared to live on that land. Now, for the first time, the dynamic was about to change. The hunted were about to become the hunters, and whatever secrets that cursed stretch of Utah desert held were about to be dragged kicking and screaming into the light.